Welcome back. Well, terrorist group Hamas announcing that it will release 6 living hostages on Saturday and give Israel the bodies of 4 others tomorrow as part of the ceasefire agreement. The terrorist group saying that the dead include the Bibas family, that's 2 young boys, Ariel and Kafir, and their mother, Shiri. They were taken captive during the October 7th attack, and they've become symbols of the hostage crisis. Israel has not yet confirmed that they are, in fact, dead. It's expected that they will be released, and that will be in exchange for Palestinian prisoners that will be released as well. Hamas still holding dozens more hostages. Joining me now is UN Watch Executive Director Hillel Neuer. Hillel, thanks very much for being here. The story of the Bibas family is so incredibly heartbreaking to see pictures of the mother and her 2 sons. Your reaction?
Look, let's recall that what Hamas did on October 7th was even worse than the Nazis. The Nazis committed the worst atrocities, but they tried to hide them from population in Germany, their own, and certainly from the world. The Hamas did the opposite. Hamas committed a massacre, murdering, torturing, raping, and broadcast the whole thing on October 7th on GoPro to the people of Gaza. So this is Hamas that kidnapped the Bibas family, a mother and her 2 babies, 9-month-old and a 4-year-old. And if they are returned dead, Hamas murdered them. If you kidnap a mother and her 2 babies, you're responsible for them. If you return them dead, they were murdered by Hamas, and the world needs to hold them to account. Sadly, the heads of Hamas are sitting pretty in Doha, Qatar. They're allowed to go to Turkey, and the world seems to, allow that. Other than the U.S. and maybe a few others, there's no outrage from the world.
Right, and that's why I said they were murdered, because we have to be clear here about what has taken place. And there's no equivalency to what's going on here. The fact that hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners are being released for committing serious crimes, terrorism against the world, and that's in exchange for what? 20 hostages so far out of the 73?
Look, sadly, there have been some media like the BBC repeatedly have to apologize because they say Israel returned hostages. When Israel returned Yahya Sinwar, the man who was in Israeli prison because he strangled Palestinians with his own hands, they weren't returning a hostage. They were returning a murderer with blood on his hands. Sadly, Israel made a mistake. They returned him years ago, and he became the mastermind of the October 7th massacre. Once again now, Maria, they're returning dozens, hundreds of convicted Palestinians, others who may not have been convicted but who were detained because they were engaged in terrorism. These are not hostages. These are terrorists, many of them who are convicted murderers.
Right. That's why I want to be clear about that, because this agreement calls for a total of 1,700 Palestinian prisoners to be released, who obviously are serious prisoners. Meanwhile, Israel's foreign minister has confirmed that the second phase of the ceasefire negotiations will begin this week. We were waiting to hear the terms of this second phase. The initial deal included a 42-day truce, the return of 33 hostages. Israel says it remains engaged in the process, but it will not accept Hamas's presence in Gaza. Your thoughts? Is that a realistic notion that Hamas will not have any role in any governance of Gaza after this is all said and done?
Yeah, look, Maria, there's a dilemma here, and 2 things are true. Number 1, Hamas cannot remain in control in Gaza. I believe Israel and the United States are firm on that. The Trump administration understands that Hamas are monsters. They're situated meters away, a few yards away from communities in Gaza, in Israel. And we saw what they did on October 7th. If Hamas is allowed to stay in power, we're going to see October 7th again. We're going to see war again, dragging in the whole Middle East. Hamas cannot remain in power. They are monsters. They need to be removed. Just Gaza needs to be denazified. All right. That's number 1. Number 2, the dilemma is that Israel still has, as you mentioned, dozens of hostages there. So Israel has to enter some kind of deal with the devil to get those hostages home. But the end game has to be removing Hamas. So the challenge now for Israel's negotiators are to figure out in the next term how to get the hostages back, but not to allow Hamas to re-entrench and commit another massacre.
Right, because, Hamas keeps pushing back and Iran is pushing back. No one's going to tell them what to do with their nuclear weaponry, and they will continue building it. So you do think it's realistic, though, to believe that they'll come up with some agreement, doing a deal with the devil to ensure that Hamas has nothing to do with Gaza. what do you think of President Trump's plan that the U.S. goes in there and redevelops it?
Look, I think President Trump put an important truth on the table, which is that for the past decades, we hear that the Palestinians in Gaza, that their home is not in Gaza. What the UN agency UNRWA has been teaching Palestinians, and of course, President Trump announced he's going to defund UNRWA. And yesterday, here in Switzerland, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate announced that they are calling for the defunding of UNRWA after I appeared there last month. So there are people who understand what that Palestinians calling them refugees forever, even when they live in Gaza, is not the solution. President Trump said, I want to. If you're refugees and you're suffering, I'm going to find you homes elsewhere. They said, no, you can't uproot us from our homes and lands. Wait a minute. The world and the UN is telling us they're refugees, and then when Trump says, I'm going to find you a beautiful home somewhere in the region, you say, oh no, you can't uproot us from our homes and lands. It's one or the other. Either you're refugees and you accept whatever President Trump is offering you, or number two, you are not refugees, and the whole UNRWA thing should be ended.
Well, UN Watch bringing together activists and dissidents from all over the world, including Jimmy Lai's son, Sebastian Lai, to speak at the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. I've spoken with Sebastian Lai on this program about his father's arrest recently. Watch. What's the most egregious national security law that China has implemented in Hong Kong, in your view?
It's incredibly wide-ranging, but it goes from the smallest things, such as like in social media posts, and what we mentioned before, to what they've done to my father. My father was a peaceful campaigner for the last 30 years, always advocated for peace, never called for Hong Kong independence. Was always wanted the Hong Kong the joint declaration between Hong Kong and China to be kept and have democracy, and that's all he did for the last 30 years. And then they sent 200 journalists to raid his newspaper, arrested his colleagues, locked him up in prison for the last four years, again in solitary confinement, in completely inhumane conditions.
Hillel, what about that? Is there any way to tame communist China with all of these new laws that they threw down when they went into Hong Kong, took Jimmy Lai and other freedom fighters away and put them in jail? Tell us more.
Look, Jimmy Lai is a hero. This is a man who's 77 years old, extremely successful. He could have escaped from Hong Kong as the Beijing regime put their communist clutches to extinguish democracy there. He said, no, I'm staying with my people.
Yeah.
He's a man of faith and principle. He's sitting in solitary confinement. It's outrageous. Yesterday here in Geneva, we hosted the Geneva Summit for Human Rights. We brought Sebastian Lai to talk about his father before ambassadors, before the world. We brought victims of other tyrannies from China, from Russia, from Cuba, Venezuela, Eritrea. And the point is that the world has to understand the Chinese communist regime, these are an evil bunch of people. We heard testimonies yesterday, not only from Sebastian Lai, but from a Tibetan political prisoner who was thrown in prison at the age of 15. We heard from the son of Wang Binzhang, who's been in prison for over 20 years, a pro-democracy person. The more you hear about the atrocities of the Chinese regime, it's shocking that people do business as usual with the folks in Beijing.
Yeah, Hillel, great to have you this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you.